No. Right. This part of the program, Liam's going to be leading a panel on publishing. So here you go, Liam.
All right. Well, you've heard two different talks. One talking about CSS and XSLFO. One talking about XSLFO and CSS. Two sides of the same coin, maybe. I don't know. Life is a shambles. So we thought we would have a panel after these two talks so that you could have a bit of open discussion and ask people questions. And I didn't prime the panelists particularly with specific questions so much as talk about scope. So the scope of this session might be really short, who knows. The scope of this session is formatting with CSS. When do you use FO? When do you use CSS? What's happening with, what do you do with HTML5 and workflow? If you're going from XML to print via HTML5, does that work? Anything of that relation, anything of that kind? Maybe I'll just ask if there's any questions first and then go down the panel and let people speak after a moment. We do have some questions. Jonathan gets the mic first.
I know that OReilly is doing work where they're basically adding hierarchy from XML to HTML with section headers, and you know, the footnotes and some missing things. I'm wondering, in the future, how much of our work do you think is going to be done that way, using familiar HTML stuff for the stuff that HTML can represent in, say, Docbook, with additional stuff added where it doesn't work?
Maybe I should just, because I happen to know exactly what they're doing, I'll just expand a bit. The question is about OReilly's workflow and how long it will be before other people are doing the same kind of thing, I think. OReilly have taken a profile of HTML, so a subset of HTML5, which is restricted. There's good reasons for that, because it can be really hard to print an animated canvas element in a book. And they've extended it using data-star attributes to add the structure that they lost when they went away from Docbook. And they have an XML schema that authors have to validate against. It's actually done in the background, and they have tools to do it. That's what's going on. But I think the question is how long before other people do this kind of stuff. Anyone?
Is it on? Yes, it is on. It's about 11 different things I want to say. I'm going to stick to the positive, nice ones. I think that I think that is the future. I think that pragmatically what people are going to do is they're going to render to HTML or some flavor of HTML, and they're going to style it with JavaScript and CSS. Not the world I imagined we'd be in 20 years ago, but that's where we're going to be. And it'll be fine. We're all smart people, and we have fast processors. We'll make it all work. Authoring in HTML and using data attributes seems awfully fragile to me for capturing important semantics for your business, for your content, the stuff you really invested in. But people are going to do that too because it's easy and it's cheap, and that's what the authors want to do, et cetera. And it's probably marginally better than sticking it in Word documents. So, okay, I think that's where we're going.
Now, you made a distinction there that I want to be, an awful lot of stuff people write doesn't have any kind of business-specific data in it. If you write something in Docbook, I mean, Docbook is very generic in the same way that HTML is generic. I would assume that it's a lot harder to do a good job of HTML for custom vocabularies.
I'm not sure I understood that question. And I think I would dispute the generality claim between Docbook or TEI or something else and HTML. I think all of the vocabularies that have been developed, JATS, TEI, I'm not going to try and name them all, are all developed with a particular industry in mind, with a particular focus in mind, and provide better semantics for that category of information than HTML does. But I mean, I'm not going to argue that you can't impose the same semantics with class attributes and things if you're so inclined. It's just not the way I would choose to do it.
I think we're talking past each other, perhaps.
Perhaps.
Maybe
What O'Reilly did was not to try to put class attributes in for sections, but add section elements that look a lot like the Docbook section elements.
HTML5 does a better job for vanilla sort of booky things or more things that look more like documents to me. I agree. I applaud the HTML5 folks for having moved in that direction.
maybe worth noting that OReilly's authors also can use Markdown, for example, kind of wiki markup, and it's converted to HTML5 on the fly in the background. And their goal was to reduce the cost of the transformations. They were doing a lot of XSLT transformations into and out of Docbook. They had tens of thousands of lines of XSLT, probably hundreds of thousands actually. And they suddenly realized a lot of them they didn't need internally for their process if they started with HTML. Whether it makes sense for anyone else, I don't know. Michael.
If we're contemplating a world in which we're rendering to HTML, which for purposes of rendering appears to be then divs and spans with a few other things from time to time that get styled in various ways, that's okay. That's as easy for me to do as to go to F&O, which for me often boils down to divs and spans with styling. The question in my mind is, what's the current state of play with regard to multiple flows on a page? Base text, commentary, footnotes, parallel text, parallel columns, parallel facing pages. Where are we on that? I can't do quite what I want in some cases with F&O, but I can do more with F&O than I know how to do currently in CSS2. So any hope?
No, I can certainly speak for Antenna House, and we've got a new release coming out, 6.2, at the end of this month, and that's going to support multi-page footnotes, so you'll be able to pull footnotes across multiple pages, column balancing. Our goal has always been to increase the quality of the output, so you've got the flows, the anchors, all that functionality. You can certainly see a lot of that in the U.S. tax publications. If you go look there, where you'll see a lot of that deployed, and they've paid for a lot of that development work. We're also trying to make equivalent functionality on the CSS side of the product, but that follows the FO functionality. But eventually it'll get there, and it's all extensions. It's goes way beyond what the standard provides for. So with the FO, if you were to count up the extensions that we've added, it's over 200 now.
So speaking as a user of these tools right now, and having gone from XSLFO to some version of CSS, and I'm using Prince, and I'm looking forward to trying out their product, it's not good, the state of play, as a user. Specs don't, the implementations don't necessarily match the specs change. You go read the specifications, you find the feature you want in one of those 60 specifications, and then you're trying to figure out, does the vendor implement that? Oh no, they have a previous version, or they have an extension to do that. That's not a good position to be in as a user. Now, you might be able to get their product to do that, but it's going to take you looking at their documentation and talking to their technical support to try and figure out how to map their state of play to the standard state of play. And that's a really bad position to be in.
So for your application there with the multiple regions and the side-by-side and things, CSS has a region spec that they're working on and other specs. So at this point, CSS is going to make better progress, assuming, as Alex said, that they all implement it the same way, than you'll find with FO at this point.
Okay, but it sounds as though the current state of play is not good, but it appears to be considered in scope rather than out of scope.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, my problem with all of this is that we're expected to wait until CSS catches up rather than anything else. That's been my position for a while.
I'll just add to what the panelists have said and note that the CSS working group has, in the last couple of weeks, have moved forward a number of specs that include column footnotes we're not happy with yet in the GCPM draft, the new draft that Dave Kramer of Hachette has done. He's the new editor of that document. So the working group does not yet have consensus on how to do column footnotes, but we do have consensus that they have to be done. Multiple flows on the same page are there as of the CSS region spec, but synchronization between them is not there yet. There's not enough control over the synchronization yet, and that, again, that will come. But I don't know how long it's going to take. My gut feeling is a year or two, but I don't know, just because of the speed things are going at right now and the business needs of people needing this. But who knows? Famous last words.
But that slide that I had from the CSS about the vendor participation, part of that was the co-chairs of the CSS working group sort of saying they don't get enough involvement from the vendors for implementing these things.
Mike?
I'd like to sort of ask about the state of standardization in this field in the context of more general questions about what gets standardized and what doesn't, and the business models for standardization. We sometimes talk as if, people who don't participate in standards activities are somehow sort of morally decrepit. And I think what we need to understand is what's the social and business dynamics of the situation that causes us to get into this situation, where there's clearly a lot of motivation from users and from suppliers to develop better products. Why do we get into the situation? Is it perhaps that as I've seen sometimes in the database field, where people are finding their business interests are to move away from standards and to develop proprietary extensions, or is it some other factor in this field that ultimately it comes more down to vendors than to users. Users always want standards. Vendors sometimes want standards, sometimes they don't, depending on the business dynamics and the competitive situation and so on. So what's the nature of this business that has caused a slowdown in standards activity?
Let me answer from a vendor point of view. I don't know how many of you use Antenna House, but we've got several thousand customers out there and lots of licenses. We've had our product out there for 10 years. We've essentially got 3 key developers on our formatting engines. And those would be the same people we'd have to devote to the standards. A developer spends about 60-70% of his time doing bug fixes on released versions and the balance of his time on new development. So if I had to take from those 3 people and then contribute a significant part 1 day a week, 2 days a week to standards, it just becomes a real overhead that we just don't have the resources to afford. So, we follow the standards, we try very closely to implement them, we listen to our customers' requirements for products, but that's where we're at on that. We just don't have enough people to dedicate significant resource to spending days a week on standards work. It's a sad state of affairs, but that's what it is. Bigger companies have deeper pockets and can do it.
Anyone else on the panel? Norm?
I'm not a vendor.
Yeah, you are.
I don't have an answer for that one. I'm not a vendor. I'm not doing that kind of thing. The overhead of doing standards is certainly high. I can appreciate that.
All right.
Well, from what I can see of the vendors, some of them have sort of morphed into products that handle customized output, sort of personalized mailings and things, rather than providing a general purpose XSL formatter. They've sort of got niche markets that they do. They don't advertise themselves as FO vendors, they advertise themselves as, we do this, we use the standard, so you can use FO to do the styling. So it's, as you said, I think that the vendors can wander off to greener pastures where they can make their money.
I don't have to, but I'm going to. The lack of good open source print, technology is a real problem, and that also is an issue. It's not just a business thing. Like the developers out there who want to do that, aren't there as much as they should be. And there's some, but a Wheezy print thing was kind of cool for a while, but it doesn't do enough. You can't really use it in to do good page media. So, and I don't have time to do it, unfortunately.
It's true that, for example, at a CSS face-to-face, you get maybe 40 people today, and CSS development has sped up hugely, while XSLFO development has slowed down. But part of that is web browser development, and web development is exciting. They're all hyper. They're all 6 years old. Famously, some in their behavior, but who am I to judge? I'm only 5 myself. So there's this huge dynamic energy because things move in web development, and it gives this huge dynamism and huge excitement. And when it comes to print, traditionally publishers have had, all the way back to Gutenberg, publishers have used technology that other people have largely developed. They've improved it, but they've used other people's development and have not been pushing technological leads and standardization. And over again, when we approach publishers, they'll say, well, you just standardize something and we'll use it, and it will either meet our needs or it won't, but we'll try and use it. Which is a very different mentality from going to a bank, say, and saying, well, are you happy with the web? And they say, no, how do we change it? Even maybe bank's not a good idea, a good example, actually, but a web design agency, though, versus a print design agency, the attitudes are very different towards the technologies. I don't actually see how to change that strongly, but we are changing it a little bit by getting... The thing that has happened in publishing is that publishers have woken up to the fact that the publishers who have technologists in-house making ebooks are the ones most likely to survive, and the ones who are sending their ebooks to India and getting back PDFs, sometimes quite good, and sometimes of a quality that gets them banned from Amazon within a few days, which it does happen. Those publishers are not surviving. And we're seeing the large publishers bring that work back in-house. Pearson has just announced they're doing it recently. They're doing in-house experiments, for example, and they had, for their work at, and they're one of well, they're the largest pretty much in the publishing world. I say pretty much because they keep buying each other. It's hard to keep track, but they're more than $10 billion a year, huge. And they've taken this technology in-house. But they're not W3C members today, although Hachette and Bloomberg, who are two others of that order of magnitude size, they are members.
I think it's also worth observing that writing a good quality formatter for printed pages is a ferociously difficult thing to do. The human eye is remarkably acute at the tiniest little differences, and getting a page that really looks good is an extraordinarily difficult task. And the requirements beyond being able to do a novel, which isn't that challenging, I think when you get beyond that stage, the requirements become more and more diverse. So the sorts of things that Michael wants to do with layouts that are kept in parallel and have various regions and things is just a really, really hard problem. And so it's difficult to spec correctly, and it's an investment of significant energy to code correctly. And so it's just hard. Harder than lots of other problems, even though all of us grow up reading books and not thinking perhaps that it's as difficult as it actually is.
Well, yeah, about the headers and footers, the CSS, the best you can do is put 16 strings around the edge of the page. And the Paris presentation from Dave Kramer that I referred to, he talked about as difficult. He had author's name, a little dingbat, and the book title in his header, and it was difficult because one of them was in italics and one of them wasn't. He had to use up 3 of his 16 strings to do that. But say the S1000D standard for aircraft maintenance, there's a specification of I think it's 6 or 8 things you need to put in the footer of every page about applicability and all the rest of it. But I haven't seen anything in the CSS activity saying they want to do more than their 16 strings. They seem happy with 16 strings.
Tony, had he been using Antenna House instead of Prince, he would have been able to use the element open paren, close paren, which I mentioned in my talk, which lets you take an arbitrary element, and it is a standard part of CSS. It's not a vendor extension. It lets you take a marked up formatted element and put it into one of those 16 areas. So in fact, he would not have had that problem had he been using. It just happens that Prince and Antenna House each have different amounts of CSS implemented. But it is possible. I admit I only discovered it recently.
Right, because Bert Voss in his list of things shows mathematics in headers of journal articles and says that's not really possible.
Yep, it is possible, and I've done it. It's just not obvious. And a lot of this thing it's the same with web design, right? It's like getting a border around a div in HTML that survives changing the size of the browser. Getting an image border. Originally, people did all sorts of different techniques, and people said it's not possible. And then along comes the barn door technique, which a whole bunch of people invented separately, including me, actually, but only because I didn't bother going to do enough research. And now CSS has an image border function where you give tileable images to make a resizable border. But you could do it if you were ingenious enough before. There's a whole bunch of stuff like that people can do with great ingenuity. And heck, if you go back to 1475, I think it is, 1476, the first use of printers' flowers rotated in. Someone said, "What if we rotate if we rotate these little ornaments, we can get a really neat pattern for a border?" And they did it. Right, but it's a question of finding inventive ways of using the technology. So some of it is disseminating how to do stuff and learning and finding some kind of forum where we can share how the heck do you do put mathematics in the running header.
I guess, the fact that you have to be remarkably clever and discover these truly Baroque sorts of things to make what appear to be simple requirements work is one of the frustrating things. As somebody who is attempting to write style sheets for other people to publish with, working out what markup to produce to make it work is a challenge. And the fact that some things require 4 extra levels of div and span is just remarkably frustrating.
My attitude is you can only do this and keep any sanity at all if you decide that your HTML is an intermediate format, just like the FO was, and that you generate it. If you try and do print with HTML without generating it, then yes, you'll end up with 20 div elements that you shouldn't need. To format .leaders, then you add a span class equals leader and a span class equals page in order to be able to color them differently. Yes, it's crazy.
Yeah, and it still doesn't work because the dots didn't line up, but never mind.
I didn't do that with FO. I didn't do it with CSS, sorry. But you're right, they line up in Prince and not Antenna House right now. There's a property to say where they should line up. Do you have a question? Or are you asking for the microphone?
In this particular regard, XPAC is your friend. I use it extensively, and I have a multi-stage process where I produce actually not one HTML, but several HTML flavors along the way, and they get enhanced until the very end, and then I run that through the formatter. And that actually works quite well.
Okay, any other questions? It's gone quiet. They're exhausted of all this HTML stuff. Let's get back to XML and coffee, right? Thank you, everyone.